Good morning, Metro. Thank you, David, for that reading. You always get the timing and the inflection perfectly. So for that, I'm grateful. And thank you, Ben, for the music this morning. I feel like it always takes a load off the preacher when the musicians give their own prophetic word. So thanks for that one. Rachel Held Evans once said that God has a funny habit of using people that we don't approve of. Maybe some of you relate to this quote and can recall times that you felt the Holy Spirit leading you towards something or someone that you didn't want to deal with at all. In today's story, we see Jesus being led to the kind of person that absolutely no one in his community ever wants to speak to, the dreaded tax collector. Which Tiffany and I have been laughing this week. We did not choose this text to fall during the busiest part of tax season, nor am I trying to trigger anyone who maybe feels less than liberated in the wake of our Liberation Day. So bear with me. Zacchaeus in the ancient Greek means pure one, which in this story is unbelievably ironic because tax collectors were known for being anything but. People who chose this profession were so disliked by other members of the community that often throughout the biblical text, you'll see people using the phrase, Jesus hung out with the lowlifes, he hung out with the sinners and tax collectors, right? They were so bad, they needed their own category. And when you dive a little deeper into the history of the Roman Empire, I think you can understand why. The Judean community that Jesus was a part of paid a lot of taxes, as are the rest of us about to do so. Judea was at this point in time a conquered entity of the Roman Empire, which means that they had to pay taxes to Rome. So the emperor at the time, who was Caesar Augustus, he knew that maintaining such a vast global empire was no easy work, and one thing to keep it all stabilized was you got to make sure the folks at home feel content and well taken care of. And so in order to keep people happy in Rome, Caesar would collect taxes from conquered territories and use that to feed his own citizens in excess. So he would give rations of grain to each Roman household, and it was said that the amounts that he gave to each household could feed roughly twice the number of people that they were actually given to. So here's the Judean people who are forced to pay taxes to Rome, most of which they never get to see come back and return towards the betterment of their communities. And then to add insult to this injury, these taxes are collected by individuals from the conquered communities themselves. It was this predatory and shady system where taxes owed for each community would be auctioned off by Rome to the highest bidders. So these tax collectors would come and they would buy up all the taxes plus some interest, because it's the highest bidder. And then in order to go make that money back and then some, they'd have to go chase down people in the community to pay their taxes to Rome and then also, keep a little bit extra for themselves. And so they had several different methods to do this. They had lots of different ways for trying to squeeze every last penny out of this community that was already struggling. So one thing they would do is they might come to your property to collect your property tax, and they might inform you that your land was now double or triple the value that it was the year before, and that you would owe accordingly. They also had no concern over whether you'd already paid your taxes or not. You might be visited by one tax collector one day and demanded to pay over, and then a few days later you might be visited by another tax collector and have to pay the same tax over again. It was a system that made it nearly impossible for anyone in all of Judea to not live in poverty. Most of everything they earned had to be given over to the tax collector. And what would happen if they couldn't pay? Well, the tax collector would be happy to offer them a loan at an absurdly high interest rate that they would likely be paying off for the rest of their natural lives. It was the ancient times version of payday loans. All this goes to say, it is not hard to understand why Jesus' community had such a passionate hatred for the tax collector. They were traitors to their own people. They worked with the very entity that was oppressing them in order to gain a financial advantage. The hatred and the scorn of the tax collector ran deep. They were total outcasts in their society. They were disowned by their friends. They were banned from going into the synagogues, and they weren't even allowed to exchange money at the temple, right? Their money was no good there. The local religious leaders even bent their own laws of morality when it came to this group of people. While they encouraged generally for their parishioners to be honest people, many rabbis determined it was okay to lie if you were lying to get out of paying your taxes. They said it, not me. So wouldn't you know it, as Jesus stops in the city of Jericho on his way into Jerusalem, and as he's greeted by a crowd of onlookers, who is the first person that he seeks out? Zacchaeus isn't just any tax collector either. He's the chief tax collector. That means he's at the top of the food chain in this awful system that causes so much pain and suffering in his community. And he doesn't just talk to him, which would already be scandalous enough, but he insists that Zacchaeus take him to his house for dinner. God has a funny habit of using people we don't approve of. Wouldn't you agree? As many of you know, we've enjoyed getting to journey through the Lenten season together this year with our theme, Everything in Between. As part of this theme, we explore two concepts which are seemingly in opposition to each other. We've talked about being lost and found, having faith and works, being a stranger and a neighbor. The theme reminds us that even in a world that wants to sell us these black and white notions of two binaries, one or the other, we know that life is often not so straightforward. We do not exist in neat opposing binaries, but rather we live in the messy in-betweens. And this week's theme is righteousness and mercy. In life, we're often made to believe that we can only have one or the other of these virtues. We can have limitless mercy or righteous indignation, punishment or grace. We're taught that as people, we are either all good or all bad, virtuous or immoral. But I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus chooses the most extreme category of person to publicly affirm in this story. We already know to this point that Jesus is a compassionate person with an especially empathetic heart towards those who are outcasts. But the other outcasts he shows mercy to in other parts of the Bible, they're a little bit easier for us to swallow and wrap our minds around because they're mainly vulnerable and defenseless people, like widows and lepers, cast out of society through no fault of their own. The tax collectors, on the other hand, have arguably chosen their own destiny. They have sought out an immoral life for themselves to gain riches at the expense of their neighbors. What good could Jesus possibly have seen in someone so immoral as Zacchaeus? So we establish that out of all the harm a person could perpetuate in the Judean community, the tax collectors were among the most extreme examples, right? They'd get listed right alongside the robbers and the murderers. And thus, I want to briefly tell us a story today, shift our attention to the story of someone who we might very well consider to be on the extremes of our modern society. A guy named Christian Pacholi. He was a lonely 14-year-old back in the 1980s who was smoking a joint out in an alleyway one night when he was approached by an older guy, a 28-year-old guy, who invited him to be a part of the local white power neo-Nazi movement. The man told him, "Stop smoking that stuff. That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile." Pacholi says he didn't really have much of an idea at 14 years old what a communist or a Jew was, but he liked the idea of having friends and community. He was a child of Italian immigrants who came to this country in the 1960s, and like so many immigrants in the US, they had to work 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, to provide for their family's basic needs. So he'd spend a lot of his childhood alone. He was bullied at school, and his early adolescent years were sad, isolated, and filled with angst. He saw that I was lonely, and I was certainly doing something that put me on the fringes already, smoking pot in an alley, He knew that I was searching for three very important things: a sense of identity, a community, and a purpose. The Chicago area skinheads offered all three to him, and from that one conversation in the alley, Pacioli was ready to jump right in. It was the first time in my young life that I felt like someone had actually paid attention to me and empowered me in some way, he says. Despite having some doubts about the group's ideology, the rewards of inclusion and empowerment were greater than anything he had experienced before. Christian quickly rose from a simple foot soldier to the head of the Chicago skinhead movement. He started a band that made white supremacist music, and he thinks he might have directly recruited around 100 new members into the movement. But as it turns out, unfortunately for him, being a full-time Nazi doesn't really pay the bills, and Pacioli in his early 20s had a growing family to feed. So since he was already a musician, he decided to start his own record store. He knew that it was unlikely that the state of Illinois would grant him a business license if he said he wanted to start a record store that sold white power music. And so therefore, he had to sell all different types of music at his store, something that would bring in a different type of crowd than he was used to spending his time around. So the store brought in the exact kind of people that he'd been taught his whole life he was supposed to hate. Black people, brown people, Jewish people, gay people. Many of them, too, knew exactly what he was up to on the side, but still offered him an amount of grace and understanding far beyond what he was deserving of at that time in his life. And eventually, slowly but surely, he begins to untangle himself from this harmful ideology that had so greatly poisoned his mind during his troubled youth. It took him quite a while to leave because this group of people, despite their many, many, many flaws, had been the only family and community that he'd known for most of his life. When he finally stepped down and left the movement, he had a friend that helped him get a low-level IT job. And as fate would have it, his very first assignment on the job was installing computers at one of the many high schools he attended and was kicked out of for fighting as a teenager. At this point in his life, he was hoping to be anonymous, to quietly leave his troubled past behind him and live whatever normal life was possible for a former skinhead. He was experiencing, however, severe depression. He was unsure of who he was, where he belonged, or what his purpose was anymore. All he knew was that he wanted to be a better person. I was waking up every morning wishing that I hadn't, says Pacioli. Back at his former high school, he was hoping to quickly do his job and get out without being noticed, but then he recognized the black security guard who he had taken particular joy in tormenting in his years as a radicalized teenager. Pacioli, smartly or not, follows the security guard, John Holmes, to his car in the school parking lot and tapped him on the shoulder. And the security guard turned around and jumped back when he recognized him, understandably. He was afraid. And Pacioli's not sure what to do at this moment, and so all he can do is extend his hand and say, "I'm sorry." John Holmes shook his hand and thanked him for the apology, but he says, "If you really mean it, you need to do more." The two men sat and talked for a while. Pacioli shared his experiences and told him that he had left the movement. Holmes embraced him and made him promise that he would continue to tell his story. This was another hugely pivotal moment for Pacioli, one that he says he believes saved his life. It helped him to understand that running away from his past was not an option. He needed to find a way to repair some of the damage he had caused and seek forgiveness from those that he had hurt. He was first unsure of how to make this new calling a reality, but it would all become more clear one day at a chance encounter at the local mall. He's walking around and he was approached by a young man who recognized his tattoos. Tattoos that would seem normal to the average person, but if you're a part of the white power movement, you recognize them as such. And so the young man came up and excitedly greeted him, thinking he was meeting another brother in the movement. And Pacioli kindly let him know that he wasn't a part of the movement anymore, that he had left that behind, and that if this young man was ever interested in doing the same, that there was a way out, that there was another life that was possible for him. And from that moment on, his new mission was born: to meet with folks radicalized into extremist communities and let them know that there were other, more fulfilling and more meaningful lives they could live if they were ready and willing to walk away. Since that day, he thinks he's recruited directly around 400 people out of extremist movements. Why am I telling you this story? Well, in the biblical story we read today, we see how Jesus' message can reach even the most unexpected and, let's face it, unsettling people. Jesus picks Zacchaeus out of the crowd and calls him by name and invites him into the intimate act of sharing a meal. But just as much as Jesus sought out Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus was also clearly seeking out Jesus. When he realized that he was too, let's put it, vertically challenged to see Jesus above the large crowds, this grown man climbs up into a sycamore tree just to get a glimpse of the prophet, the one that they had all been hearing about, the one who heals people from their ailments, and the one who invites misfits and outcasts into the community. The crowd understandably groans at the sight of Jesus so openly associating with someone considered a lowlife in their community. But it's only with the slightest bit of prompting that Zacchaeus offers to try to make things right, to give back all that he's stolen from the community and then some. Christian Pacioli knew for a long time that he wanted a way out of his old life, but it took him a long time to work up the courage to actually break away. It was with the help and kindness of friends and strangers alike that he had the courage to leave his old ways of hatred and harm behind and finally be able to use his gifts for good. We don't know much about Zacchaeus outside of the story in Luke, but I wonder if, prior to that day that Jesus arrives in Jericho, if he'd been looking for a way out as well. Being a tax collector was a profession that completely isolated you from all friends and family. Sure, it brought riches, but at what cost? This might lead one to wonder what Zacchaeus' life was like before that made him so willing to take a job that would make him a pariah to the community. Maybe he was already alone and outcasted. Maybe he felt like he didn't have anything to lose. Maybe this encounter with Jesus was the first time in a long time, or maybe ever, that he felt loved, seen, and cared for. Given his reputation and his job, it was likely that he was not often privy to having people come and eat in his home with him. How does God want us as a community to treat those who have caused us harm? Are we to stand firm in our righteousness, or are we to show mercy as often as we can? Church communities have historically had bad habits of swinging too far in one direction or the other. We're quick to cast people out when we believe they have not lived up to our moral standards. But on the other side, this has happened all throughout history, but more recent examples would be in the Southern Baptist Church and the Catholic Church. We're a little too quick to offer total forgiveness to our leaders, especially our male leaders, who use their authority for predatory and harmful purposes. Is there a messy middle that we can come to? An important thing to note about Zacchaeus' story is that Jesus does not offer grace and salvation until Zacchaeus shows he's willing to begin the process of undoing some of the harm that he has caused. He sought out Jesus and seemed willing to do the work it would take to rejoin the community and to re-earn the community's trust. Grace and mercy do not have to come without accountability. Grace and mercy do not have to come at the cost of sacrificing your values. These stories that I've highlighted this morning are not meant to be a blanket defense or excuse for people who are actively causing harm. And I'm certainly not encouraging any of you to go out forgiving and sympathizing with your local extremist groups. But we do live in a society that experiences a lot of systemic issues, systemic levels of suffering, and we feel satisfied sometimes going and blaming this on individual moral failings. Christian story is just one example, but it's true that most people who fall into extremism do so because they were in a particularly vulnerable place to begin with. We see this all the time with young men from poor areas who are recruited into a life of violence because it feels like it's their only chance for communal and economic opportunities. We see this with terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They often arise out of anger towards the West and are never-ending campaigns of war and terror in their homelands. Every day, otherwise regular people are recruited into extreme ideology because they feel like it is the only way to get their core needs met. And this doesn't excuse their actions or make it okay, but it is important to try and understand where every individual might be coming from. And when and if they're fully ready to start anew, our communities might consider slowly welcoming them back in, just as Jesus does in Luke. Zacchaeus had harmed the community, but he had also, at least at one point in time, been a part of that community, as had all the other tax collectors. He was a part of the flock. We were reminded in last week's story how God doesn't allow for any part of God's flock to stay lost forever. Even when there are 100 of us and just one is missing, God will relentlessly search until the one is found. We are not whole until all members of our flock have at least been given the opportunity to return. Pacioli, in his work of meeting vulnerable young people at risk of falling into extremism, he says his strategy isn't to argue with them around their ideology, because it's ultimately not the ideology which has pulled them in that direction to begin with. What he does is he meets with broken and vulnerable people who, the way he describes it, have potholes in their life that they're looking to fill with someone or something. So instead of arguing with them about their ideology, he identifies the potholes in their lives and sees what ways he can be able to fill them. Now, the examples I've shared today are more extreme, so on the surface it may not seem that all of this might relate to us, but I think we might all be able to identify with the idea of having a few potholes in our lives, of feeling a little lost, and maybe making some mistakes or causing some harm in our attempts to fill those potholes. We've all done and said things we know we shouldn't. We've all at one point or another hurt or disappointed people in our communities who trusted and relied on us. Public defense lawyer and legal advocate Brian Stevenson, in his book Just Mercy, reminds us that we are all more than the worst things that we've ever done. We own up to our mistakes and our harm, but we don't have to be defined by them either. We have mercy for others who've done wrong because we want people to have mercy on us as well. God reminds us in this story that when harm is done, we don't have to be forced into a choice of righteousness or mercy. God reminds us that we're complicated beings who are neither all good nor all bad. Jesus invites us in whatever ways we're capable to try and make our communities whole again, to leave a pathway of redemption open to those who are truly ready and willing to walk that very difficult path. Jesus invites us to display both righteousness and mercy without ever having to sacrifice one for the other. And as Jesus makes his final steps towards Jerusalem, we get to make our steps towards our communion table this morning.